Created and heavily used during the 80s, the gated reverb is a special effect that's used mainly on snare drums to give them a really huge sound that's also very tight as well. This effect is heavily used in synthwave music, and we'll also be using it on our tom drums and also some of the hi-hats as well. To create this effect, you first want to create a send, so we can do that now. And actually first let's go ahead and just group all of our drums just to keep everything a bit organized. So I'll just hit Command G or Control G on a Windows PC. I'm on a Mac, so it's Command. And we'll just rename that drums, just to keep everything a bit organized. And then let's go ahead and hop over to our mixer and create a new send. So we'll do a return track, and we'll name that something like snare verb. And the way that this effect works is you load a really large reverb onto the send. And then after the reverb on that same send channel, you set up a gate, which is going to open whenever the snare hits, and then it closes afterwards. So it's basically like a reverse sidechain effect. So you want to make sure that this is set up on a send rather than an insert effect in order to get the proper sound. So let's go ahead and just solo out our snare layer. And let's also send that to the send. And just go almost all the way up because we want quite a bit of signal sent over to our send here. And for this sound, I just want to have it done to this top layer, which is kind of the acoustic snare drum. And I don't want that sent to the synth layer. That way it keeps everything nice and punchy. So we'll just apply it to this layer. So we'll first load up a reverb. So we'll just use the built-in one inside of Ableton. Swap over to the send and load up that reverb. And you can use any of your favorite reverb plugins here. I'd recommend using something like a plate reverb to get even more of an 80s style effect. But for this video, we're just going to use the built-in reverb to show you how it works. Now let's also load up a really large preset here. We could do something like a big room. So we'll just drag and drop that on. And then I want to take the decay time and put that up to 10.3 seconds. Another important thing to note as well is you want to make sure that the dry wet is set to 100% because we've loaded this reverb onto a send channel. Now let's also turn on the chorus as well so we get kind of this interesting pitch shifted reverb. Bring that density up to about 96. So all the way up. And on its own, it just sounds like this. If I was to solo out that reverb, you can hear this very long reverb that's ringing out. And right now, it totally just drowns out the entire snare drum sound. So let's fix this by adding in the gate effect. And this is where the main character of this gated reverb comes from. So we'll just drag and drop in the Ableton Live built-in gate. Then we could expand the menu here. We want to go ahead and set the sidechain input to the snare drum. And make sure that's set to the main snare and not the synth tom snare. And basically what this is going to do is it's the inversion of a sidechain effect. So instead of ducking whenever the snare drum hits, the gate is going to open up and let our reverb through whenever the snare hits. And then whenever that sound dies out, the gate will close, which will turn off the reverb sound. So on its own, it just sounds like this. So you can see on this little icon here that that gate is closing rather quickly whenever our snare drum hits. It's basically just following the contour of the snare. We want to make a few different adjustments to this. The first of which will be adjusting the threshold down to negative 15.3. So it's a bit lower. And then we want to bring the hold up to an amount of 98. And take the release and put that at 230. So that way we have a much longer release. So you can hear we get this very punchy but very large sounding reverb. In context of the snare drum, it sounds like this. And that's that classic 80s gated reverb tone. It sounds very large, but it's also very tight and punchy as well. And that's created all through using this gate to basically sculpt the contour of that reverb. If you wanted a shorter reverb, you could always take down the release, which is also another commonly heard effect inside a lot of 80s tracks. But for this track, I wanted a little bit larger and longer of a reverb tone. So I just went ahead and increased that up to a higher amount so that it gave me a little bit longer of reverb. So feel free to adjust this accordingly depending on what type of tone you're going for. Then the next thing that I want to do is bring up the volume of the reverb and make it sound a little bit more full. The key to getting this sound is to have a compressor after the gated reverb. So we'll go ahead and pull in the glue compressor, which is just a SSL modeled bus compressor. which also was quite popular during the 80s as well. So that kind of fits with the whole 80s feel that we're going with. So we can leave the attack at an amount of 1, take that release down to its minimum amount. We can take the threshold and put that down to -28.3. And then we'll take the makeup gain, put that to just over an amount of 5. That sounds like this. So it makes our reverb a lot punchier. So because we've added that compression after the reverb, it gives us a much punchier snare tone, which is what you're going for with these 80s gated reverbs. From there, I want to clean things up just a little bit. Let's go ahead and drop in an EQ8 and cut out some of those sub-bass frequencies that are sort of hanging out in the snare reverb. We just turn off these other bands, and then we can move over to the low cut and just have that 102. So that way we don't have any really low sub-frequencies that are hanging out in the reverb signal. So there's not much of an audible difference, but it's just to kind of keep things a bit cleaner sounding so we don't have any phasing problems later with our mix. Another thing that I also want to do as well is I'm going to take the hi-hats and send them to the same gated reverb. This will give us a cool reverb effect where the open hi-hat, whenever the snare drum is hitting, is going to have this kind of washed out, interesting reverb on it that then fades out as the sound progresses. So let's go ahead and send the hi-hats over. So we'll go to our hi-hats and do about something similar. Turn it all the way up. It sounds like this. Sounds kind of weird on its own, but in context. So it just helps those hi-hats feel a little bit more explosive whenever that open hat hits. It also kind of helps it blend a bit better with the snare drum. So altogether, so far, what we have sounds like this. So we're getting pretty close to the sound that we're going for. The next change that I want to make is go ahead and add some gated reverb to these tom drums, which is also another common 80s effect where you have these synthesized toms sent into their own gated reverb. So let's go ahead and create another send here, or another return track. And we'll just name this something like tom verb. And the reason I want to do these on their own separate channel is so that the synth toms can be used as a sidechain source for the reverb. Because this one is being triggered by the snare drum, and the second one will be triggered by the synth toms. So we can go ahead and send those over to our reverb. We could solo them out. Now let's also just loop them. That way we kind of just loop the section that we're working on here. Hop back over to the mixer, drop in a reverb. And we'll actually just use the same preset as before, which is the big room preset. Take the density all the way up and turn on the chorus. Make sure the dry wet is turned all the way up. And on its own, it just sounds like this. So super 80s, which is what we're going for. And for this, I'm actually going to have a shorter decay time because I quite like the way that that sounds. I don't want it to be too big because that way it rings out too much into these other sections. And then let's go ahead and drop the gate on like we did previously. So we'll take the gate, open that up, and set the sidechain source to the tom drums. And all sorts of different music softwares have their own version of this gate. It may look slightly different than the one that's built into Ableton, but every software like Logic, Pro Tools, Cubase, all those different softwares have the ability to gate reverbs. So let's make a few different adjustments. We'll take the threshold down to what we had previously on the other gated reverb, which is -15.3. Gonna bump that hold up to an amount of 98. So that way the gate holds open for a little bit. And let's also bump the release up to about 96. And it sounds like this. So for these tom drums, this effect is a little bit less drastic whenever the sound is hitting, but as soon as the toms end, we can hear that that reverb turns off. which is what we want for this gated reverb effect. So for the reverb that's on the snare, we have a more lush and intense sounding reverb, but for the tom drums, it's a little bit more subtle. So altogether, it sounds like this. So you can hear it really tightens up that reverb, especially in those silent moments, which is what you want for the gated reverb effect, which is what we're going for. Now for this reverb, I don't want to compress this signal. And the reason being is I want to have this reverb be a little bit softer sounding, so it doesn't take the focus away from the other elements. We have this very lush, gated snare drum reverb. It's very intense sounding, and these toms are just kind of more of a fill to fill up some of the space at the end of the different sections. So now altogether, those completed drums sound like this. Whereas before it sounded like this. So you can hear with that example that this gated reverb really adds a lot of character to the drums. It makes them sound super retro and also very 80s as well, which is what we're going for with the synthwave track. So that completes all the different drum parts. In the next videos, we'll be moving on to some of the synthesizer patches.